Hi everyone, this is Jason and I'm back with another video regarding the 2020 Taiwan election. So I want to present a very simple statistical analysis on the 2020 election done by Dr. Ma Ziheng about a couple months ago. And I also have a peer review of his findings done by a NYU mathematics professor. Dr. Ma Ziheng published a working draft of a statistical analysis showing a strong positive correlation between the KMT and DPP parties when comparing the relative support rate between the November 24, 2018 local elections and the January 11, 2020 presidential election in 5 cities. A strong positive correlation in these 5 major areas of Taiwan, which make up 58% of Taiwan's voters, is a large enough sample size to make legitimate claims regarding the election. The paper claimed that a strong positive correlation in these areas could only be due to ballot theft of opposition candidate Han Kuo-yu and ballot stuffing for incumbent president Tsai Ing-wen. This study was done with published figures from the Central Election Commission website. Okay, so I want to establish that all of the numbers, all the data, the ballots coming out of the voting stations are coming from the Central Election Commission website. You can go and download the Excel file for 2018 and 2020, and you can do the study yourself. It's available in the Google Drive that I have listed in the description. Okay, so this is the first page of Dr. Ma's analysis, and it basically explains what a relative support rate is, or RSR. A RSR is the current number of ballots found in an area for a certain candidate or party divided by the number of ballots that were gotten in the last election. So you basically take what you got this time and you divide it by what you got last time. So if you got the same amount, then you would get a value of 1. Okay, so I have some simple examples here. Let's say that you had 5,000 ballots in 2018 in an area, okay, a li, and you got 3,500 the next time in 2020. So you take 3,500, you divide by 5,000, and you get 0.7. So that means you got 70% of what you got last time. So that's a decrease in 30%. Next example is 4,500 in 2020 divided by 5,000 in 2018. That will give you a value of 0.9, which means you have a decrease in 10%. In the next example, we have 5,500 ballots that were obtained in 2020 divided by 5,000 ballots in 2018, and this will give you a RSR of 1.1, which is an increase in 10%. Next example is 7,500 ballots obtained in 2020 divided by 5,000 in 2018 will give you a RSR of 1.5, which is an increase in 50%. Last example is you got 10,000 ballots in 2020 divided by 5,000 ballots in 2018, which gives you a value of 2, which is an increase of 100%. I made the last example because there was an area that the DPP actually increased their support rate by 100%, so you will see that RSR value of 2 later on. Okay, these are the next 2 pages. The first graph is the US presidential elections for the past 40 years. The next one is New Taipei City. The last one is a graph explaining how to understand what these graphs mean. Okay, so for the purpose of understanding the graphs in these 2 papers, I presented 3 types of graphs that can help the viewer understand quickly what they mean. So when you see a strong positive correlation, that means widespread election fraud. There's ballot stuffing and there's ballot theft going on in that area. When you see negative correlation, that's normal voting behavior. Because when one side gets more, the other side gets less, and when one side gets less, the other side gets more. Now, when you see a graph with not really any correlation, like you see over there on the 3rd graph, it means there's probably partial election fraud because normal voting behavior would be negative. Another important point to make about the correlation graphs for these cities is that the turnout rate has no real impact on the correlation, whether it's positive, negative, or no correlation. An increase in voting rate or turnout rate will not change what should be a negative correlation into a positive correlation. It has nothing to do with the turnout rate. When two candidates are competing for ballots from the same group of people, it should be when one side gets more, the other side gets less, and when one side gets less, the other side gets more. However, what we saw in this election was when one side gets more, the other side gets more, and when one side gets less, the other side gets less. We saw this trend in what I would say about 95% of Taiwan's areas or voting stations. When you see a graph with positive correlation, on the right-hand side, when x-axis increases and y-axis also increases, this is due to ballot stuffing. The more positive the slope is, the more serious or the more widespread the ballot stuffing is. So when the line is going straight up, this is called pure ballot stuffing. Now, when the x-axis is getting lower and the y-axis is also getting lower, this is due to ballot theft. This is due to the fact that when one side has less, the other side also has less. That means one of the side's ballots are being stolen. And that's why the value of the x and y-axis are both low at the same time. A correlation coefficient is a statistic that measures linear correlation between two variables x and y. It has a value between +1 and -1, where 1 is total positive linear correlation, 0 is no linear correlation, and -1 is total negative linear correlation. So we can see in this graph here that if you have a positive number, the larger it is, the stronger your positive correlation is. And if your number is negative, the larger it is, the more negative it is. So we see here in this graph showing the last 40 years of US presidential elections that we have a correlation coefficient of -0.134, which is a very weak negative correlation between the two major political parties. Okay, on the next two pages we see three more graphs. The first one shows the DPP support rate increasing in a positive fashion, a very positive fashion, with the turnout rate. The second graph is the 5 cities all put together into one graph, also showing a positive correlation. And the last graph is just the KMT support rate in the 5 cities. And we can see that it peaks in Taoyuan and it also increases in Tainan, but it decreased below 1 in New Taipei, Kaohsiung, and Taichung. In this graph, we can see the DPP's relative support rate is on the x-axis and the y-axis is the turnout rate. Now, you can see on the left-hand side when the DPP support rate is decreasing, the overall turnout rate is also decreasing. However, that's not natural because there should be an increase in KMT ballots. However, there weren't. This suggests that KMT ballots were being stolen in those areas. That's why the overall turnout rate is so low. To help us understand this graph, we should note that the increase in turnout rate from 2018 to 2020 is 7.94%. Now, you can see that from about 1.5 to 2 on the x-axis, that most of that is about 10 to 20% increase in the turnout rate. This means that when DPP support increased by 50 to 100%, it also increased the turnout rate from 10 to 20%. This would suggest that almost every additional ballot that was cast in 2020 that wasn't cast in 2018 was for the DPP. This indicates deliberate ballot stuffing by the election staff. This graph shows the relative support rate of the 5 cities put into one graph. The x-axis is the KMT's RSR and the y-axis is the DPP's RSR. The correlation coefficient is 0.2627, which I would describe as a weak to moderate positive correlation. There appears to be two parts of the graph. One has a stronger positive correlation, you can see on the left, and that smaller group to the right of the one at the bottom. That group has a lower positive correlation. Now in the larger group of dots to the left, most of it on the x-axis, which is to the left of the 1, is also between 1 and 2 on the y-axis for the DPP. This would indicate that there were ballots being stolen from the KMT, and there were also ballots being added to the DPP at the same time. In that group of dots, we can see that there's also a part of it that is to the right of the 1. Now, on the y-axis for the DPP, most of those dots are in between 1.5 and 3 on the y-axis, which means that when KMT support in those areas increased by around 0 to 25%, DPP support increased by around 50% to 300%. This indicates obvious ballot stuffing. I want to point out the dots to the left of this major group of dots. Over here we can see that KMT support decreased by anywhere from about 20 to 50%. However, in that group of dots, the DPP support increased by around 200 to 325% or so. Those areas are also very irregular because if the KMT support rate is decreasing by around 20 to 50%, the DPP support rate should also be increasing by around the same amount. Now, in this second group of dots that doesn't have a very strong positive correlation, we can see that KMT support increased by around 0 to say 60% or so. Now, the DPP appears to have also increased their support, which is irregular. Their support increased in those areas by say 0 to 70%. So they're increasing at about kind of the same rate. This would suggest that there was little to no theft of KMT ballots. However, there was moderate ballot stuffing by the DPP in those areas. I want to note the dots that are below group 2 on the bottom right. The KMT support appears to be increasing by around 25 to maybe 75%, and the DPP support rate is decreasing by around 20% to about 60%. Those areas are almost normal. That is, the KMT support is increasing by about the same amount as the DPP support rate is decreasing. If the election was normal, those dots would be a part of a negative correlation graph, but we didn't see very many normal areas in this election, so that's why it's almost entirely positive. In this graph, we can see on the x-axis the areas in the 5 cities. On the y-axis, we can see the KMT's relative support rate. We can see in the red areas that the KMT lost support in New Taipei, lost a lot of support in Kaohsiung, and also lost a fair amount of support in Taichung. However, in Tainan, the KMT somehow gained support, and in Taoyuan, the KMT gained a lot of support. This is very, very irregular because if the KMT was so unpopular, if Han Kuo-yu was so unpopular in this election, he would be losing support all over the nation. He wouldn't be losing support in just Taichung, Kaohsiung, and New Taipei. He would be losing support in Taoyuan and Tainan also. However, he was increasing in support in Tainan and Taoyuan. So this is a very, very telling graph that his ballots were stolen in those red areas, New Taipei, Kaohsiung, and Taichung. And they were possibly being stolen in Tainan because Tainan and Taoyuan have a very different support rate. Taoyuan has a higher support rate. Tainan has a lower support rate for Han Kuo-yu. So there could be ballot theft also going on in Tainan, just not as much as Taichung, Kaohsiung, and New Taipei. I also want viewers to pay close attention to a few areas in Kaohsiung. In Kaohsiung, KMT support decreased the most. However, there are a few areas where they didn't. You can see 2 lines that went above 1 by about, say, like 10%, and we see another line that's close to 50%, and we see a line above 2, which is about an increase of 240% for the KMT in that area. So it's very, very strange that there are about 4 areas in Kaohsiung that saw a moderate to very large increase in KMT support, yet the rest of Kaohsiung you see just, a very, very huge drop in Han Kuo-yu's support. So this suggests that there were certain areas that the election staff wasn't able to steal the ballots in. These areas deserve special attention because I would like to know why they aren't well below 1. Why aren't the ballots being stolen in those areas? It would be interesting to know whether or not the voting station that Hangori himself voted in is in one of those areas. Okay, these are the last 2 pages of Dr. Ma's report. You can see that there's one more graph there. So in this last graph, we can see the KMT support is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we can see the number of areas which have that relative support rate. So we can see basically that there are 2 peaks. There's one very large peak on the left-hand side, which has an average decrease of about 25%. However, on the right-hand side, we can see an average increase of about, say, that's about 10 to 20%, you could say. Those areas are mostly in Tainan and Taoyuan. So that means that there was little to no ballot theft in those areas. And then on that big peak over there on the left-hand side, those areas are mostly Taichung, Kaohsiung, and New Taipei City. This graph is really just another way of looking at the last graph, and it is definitely irregular because there really shouldn't be 2 peaks in the KMT's support rate. Either it should increase or it should decrease. If the KMT decrease in support was really real, there would be a more uniform drop. There wouldn't be a drop in his support rate in these areas on the left, but no drop or very little drop in his support rate on the right. That just shouldn't be happening. In a normal election, these areas should be concentrated into one group that goes from lower to higher to lower again. There shouldn't be 2 peaks like that. Dr. Samson Liu of Courant Institute of NYU later independently confirmed the results with the Central Election Commission data. Dr. Liu confirmed the 2 opposing political parties are in fact supposed to have a negative correlation with each other. His study indicates a positive correlation in all 5 cities comparing the 2018 and 2020 results in Taiwan. He found no other possibility for the positive correlation other than ballot theft and ballot stuffing. In Dr. Samson Liu's peer review of Dr. Ma's report, he's first defining what a positive and negative correlation are. I'm not going to go through it, but you can download the PDF file from the Google Drive that I'll have linked in the description. So this is a chart of the correlation coefficient and a corresponding adjective that we use to define the strength of the linear relationship. So on this page, we can see all 5 cities' correlation coefficients and the KMT's RSR compared to the DPP RSR on the y-axis. Now, notice Tainan and Taoyuan. Tainan does in fact have areas that are left of 1, which means that there was ballot theft in Tainan. However, in Taoyuan, we can see that the vast majority of the areas are above 1, which is completely different from all the other cities. Kaohsiung, Taichung, and New Taipei City have most of the areas below 1 for KMT on the x-axis, which means that there was a lot of ballot theft in those areas. However, in Taoyuan on the x-axis for Hangori's ballots, we can see that most of the areas are to the right of 1, which means we can safely assume that there was very little to no ballot theft against him in this election. This is significant because in the Taoyuan area, there's a way to determine what the actual KMT support increase is nationwide. So here's the US presidential elections again for the past 40 years, and I just wanted to remind everyone that when there is normal voting behavior, that the correlation is supposed to be negative. And we can see the correlation coefficient here is negative 0.134. However, in Taiwan in the year 2020, our presidential election shows a positive correlation, a correlation coefficient of 0.2627. Positive correlation basically means widespread election fraud. Okay, before we move on, I'd like to show how I got the RSR increase of the KMT and DPP parties in each area. You can simply go to the Excel file called 5 cities, and you find the column for DPP and KMT, and you simply scroll down, and Excel will tell you the average of that entire column. And I'd also like to reiterate that the RSR of all of these areas were obtained by dividing the 2020 results from 2018 which have all been provided by the Central Election Commission, and you can find it on their website. Okay, so to recap what happened in the 5 cities, we can see here in Taoyuan that there was a weak positive correlation of 0.32. So KMT RSR increase in Taoyuan was 29.63%. DPP RSR increase was 26.91%. This is absolutely impossible. If KMT support increased by 29% here, the DPP could not possibly increase by 26%. Taoyuan is the only area where very little KMT ballots were stolen, and the staff appeared to stuff a lot of ballots for the DPP only. So in Kaohsiung, we have a weak positive correlation of 0.37. However, we can see that most of the dots are well below 1, which means that there was a great deal of ballot theft in Kaohsiung in particular. So in Kaohsiung, the KMT RSR decrease was 32.65%. The DPP RSR increase was 43.54%. In terms of percentage, Kaohsiung has the highest decrease in support for the KMT with a huge increase in support for the DPP. Percentage-wise, it is reasonable. However, the staff would steal and stuff in different areas, resulting in a strong positive correlation still. This area was specifically targeted to steal a great number of Hangul's ballots in preparation for the June 6 recall. It was deliberate to make Han look unpopular in Kaohsiung. In Taiwan, we have a moderate positive correlation of 0.53. We can see that there's a great deal of ballot theft against Hangul, and there's also a great deal of ballot stuffing on behalf of Taiwan. So in Taiwan, the KMT had a decrease of 23.65%, DPP increased 51.74%. This is a similar situation to New Taipei City, but not as bad as that city. DPP increase in support is more than double that of KMT decrease, which is not reasonable still. So in Tainan, we see a strong moderate positive correlation of 0.57. And we can see that there's also a fair amount of ballot theft against Hangul. We can also see in this graph that in Tainan, that the ballot stuffing percentage is also extremely high. So in Tainan, we see a KMT RSR increase of 5.39%. However, we also see a DPP RSR increase of 105.84%. If KMT support increases by a small amount of 5%, how can DPP support increase by 105%? This is absolutely impossible for DPP support to double and KMT support to increase slightly. KMT support should have dropped tremendously by around 100%. This is the most obvious case of ballot stuffing among these areas. In New Taipei City, we see a strong positive correlation of 0.63. There is definitely a great deal of ballot theft, but especially ballot stuffing in this area. In New Taipei City, we see a KMT decrease of 19.73% with a DPP increase of 54.47%. The increase in DPP support is too much greater than the KMT decrease in support to be reasonable voting behavior. There was very obvious ballot stuffing in New Taipei City on a very wide and large scale. DPP increase in support is well over double that of the decrease in KMT support. Okay, so on these next 2 pages of Dr. Liu's report, he's basically experimenting with what happens when you stuff and steal ballots, and he's just basically proving that it will create a positive correlation. So the conclusion of Dr. Liu's report is as follows. Derivation of all graphs and relations are independently verified to be exact. Claim to the negative correlation between supporting rates of 2 dominating parties is verified to be true. Strong positive correlation between the result of Taiwan's 2018 and 2020 election is verified to be true. Claim that widespread unfair forces impacted the 2020 election is found no counter-argument. So to summarize, I would say 95% or more of the areas or voting stations in these 5 cities have a strong trend of deliberate election fraud composing of ballot theft and ballot stuffing committed by the election staff. There is no evidence to suggest that there was computer fraud done by the Central Election Commission. it would be very easy to find any discrepancy between the results found in person at the voting stations and the published results from the Central Election Commission. The strong difference in ballot rigging behavior between Tainan and Taoyuan compared to New Taipei City, Taichung, and Kaohsiung suggests that the staff was given different instructions in different areas, resulting in very different correlations. The statistical analysis of the 2020 Taiwan presidential election is a work in progress. Suggestions for further research. Number 1. Do the RSR comparison of remaining cities and counties where it is possible for a greater understanding of the trends of the election staff and the Central Election Commission's strategy to rig the election. Number 2. Once more data is available, have more professors of mathematics, statistics, or computer science verify the results. Number 3. Once enough confirmation has been achieved, Mayor Han Kuo-yu will have an even stronger claim to challenge the 2020 presidential election results and demand a new election. The information presented in this video has been verified by either myself or the 2 professors mentioned. If the Central Election Commission or the Criminal Investigation Bureau has an issue with any of the content in this video, I will gladly meet you guys in court and we can go over it one by one. Since all the data came from your website to begin with, this video will not be taken down if the Social Order Maintenance Act is used against me on the pretense of spreading false rumors. Looking forward to your response.